At 6:12 p.m. on October 29th, the HOA president stood in my neighbor's yard with a tape measure in one hand and the seasonal rules in the other, declaring a pumpkin illegal while a dozen children in vampire capes stared like they'd just watched someone unplug Christmas. The pumpkin, a vinyl colossus with pupils that glowed like traffic lights, drooped as the compliance cart hissed air from its valve, a slow, squealing surrender that sounded a lot like defeat. That's when my neighbor rolled a wooden archway into the strip of city-owned grass between the sidewalk and the curb, planted two 7-foot skeletons like goalposts, and said, "If you can ban pumpkins on my lawn, I'll build Halloween where you don't get a vote." Quick note before we begin: if you enjoy long, immersive neighborhood stories told straight, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. I live in Sycamore Bluffs, a place where the mailboxes match better than the marriages. The HOA covenant binder is thicker than the city code, and the board president, Miranda Chase, treats it like scripture with footnotes. She's quick, perfectly cordial, and convinced that order is a moral good. She'd posted the seasonal display reminder on October 1st. Decor under 4 feet, no strobe lights facing the street, inflatables allowed only October 25th, 31. Tasteful themes only, whatever that means, and nothing that obstructs line of sight at corners. It read like a peace plan and landed like a dare. Across from me in the gingerbread 2-story, with the blue door and the magnolia that drops leaves like leather tongues, live Tori and Caleb Whitaker. She's an art teacher who paints with the confidence of someone who doesn't need permission. He flips houses and half-finishes projects the way some people collect hobbies. They have a 10-year-old named June who counts down to Halloween starting July 5th. If October is a holiday, the Whitakers are its clergy. The pumpkin arrived on a Tuesday by freight. 2 guys in neon vests rolled it out of a crate like a downed balloon from a parade, then left Tori with a printed pamphlet that promised family-safe spectacle and needed 3 outlets on separate breakers. Tori texted the block thread, "Neighborhood photo op tonight? Yes, Miranda, it's under 10 feet. People laughed. Miranda sent a thumbs-up emoji I could feel bristle. The first night, the pumpkin made cars stop. Not just pause and smile stop, traffic stop, windows down, phones up, one lady practically kneeling in the street to get the angle that made the vinyl grin look like it was leaning toward the stars. There were cobwebs ghosting the boxwoods, a thrift store cauldron bubbled fog, and 2 skeletal hands had been zip-tied to the gutters so they crept down like the house itself might be climbing into a costume. June gave out tiny hot chocolate cups from a folding table under the oak and said "happy almost" to every kid who came. By noon the next day, a friendly reminder landed in our inboxes about height limits. At 4, Miranda's compliance cart did 2 slow passes with the laser distance meter pointed toward the pumpkin's stem. At 6, Miranda stepped out with a laminated sheet, said, "We need to be consistent," and told Tori the inflatable's measured height, 8 feet 3 inches, exceeded the preferred 4-foot guideline. Tori raised both eyebrows, then a point-of-order finger. The rule said 4 feet was the limit for unsecured yard items. The pumpkin was staked into 4 ground anchors with braided nylon, less likely to tip than a toddler. "It's secured," Tori said, patting a tie-down like a saddle. Miranda unfolded her logic. Secured means not inflatable. Kids watched like jurors who'd been bribed with gummies to keep a straight face. Caleb came out wiping his hands on a shop towel, saw the tape, and the conversation took on a gravity that only men with tools respect. He offered to lower the platform. Miranda said platforms were structures. He said they were plywood. She said plywood was a structure in spirit. He said spirit sounded like taste. She said taste had nothing to do with it. And then she asked him to power it down voluntarily so we don't have to escalate. Escalate is HOA for paperwork that grows teeth. At 6:12 p.m., Miranda thumbed her radio and said, "Let's go ahead." The compliance aide moved like a stagehand before a blackout, knelt and pinched the nozzle. The pumpkin sighed in slow collapse, face folding through bewilderment into sleep. June's hot chocolate stopped mid-pour. Tori locked eyes with Miranda and didn't blink until the grin on vinyl hit grass. "You can measure," Tori said, voice evenly laminated, "but you don't own the city strip." She looked to the right-of-way like it was a switch she'd forgotten she could flip. The two skeletons, she'd bought them on clearance in February and stored them in the garage like long, unsent letters, went up fast on the narrow grass between sidewalk and curb. They weren't on her lawn. They weren't on association property. They were on the public easement the HOA likes to pretend isn't public. Caleb rolled a wooden archway. He'd promised to use it someday for a wedding. It had been leaning on a garage wall like hope, into the same strip, and wedged its feet under river stones he'd meant to relocate for 3 years. Tori threaded a string of dim Edison bulbs overhead, clipped bat cutouts to wires, and plugged in 2 glowing eyes she'd painted with reflective paint. The effect was immediate, a haunted passage you had to walk under to approach their steps. It wasn't big, it didn't roar. It was designed to mess with you at the edge of your comfort zone, the exact inch between public and private. Miranda spoke in a tone people reserve for pets who have learned to open the fridge. "You can't build in the right-of-way." "Can't I?" Tori asked. "You said unsecured. This is secured, to your dismay." "The city?" "Exactly," Caleb said. "Let's ask them." I mention all this because from that moment, Halloween stopped being about taste and started being about jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is where quiet neighborhoods become interesting. The block split, not neatly, not along lines I could have guessed. People who love rules wobbled when the rules seemed more mood than math. People who don't love rules put on their sensible hats and said the public strip is for utilities, not theater. Parents did math on stroller widths and decided the arch was either charming or a lawsuit. And underneath it all ran the current that always hums in places like ours, suspicion that what someone says they're worried about, columns, corners, lines of sight, isn't the thing they're worried about at all. By the next morning, we had a special notice. Halloween guidelines. Clarified, it said in bold, then bullet points that dressed the same rule in a new uniform. Any installation within 10 feet of curb required prior authorization. Structures over 4 feet were strongly discouraged for safety and uniformity. The board reserved the right to remove obstructions. It didn't say who would define obstruction or uniformity. It did include a line I kept thinking about. Seasonal joy must be balanced with the association's character. People argue about character only when it's convenient. Caleb took the notice, read it, nodded like a locksmith listening to a stuck pin, and at noon he screwed 2 anchors through the archway's feet into the dirt on the public strip. "Now it's secured," he said, "and now it's not going anywhere unless a tornado asks nicely." By mid-afternoon, small acts multiplied. Somebody down the street put 2 modest pumpkins in a little wagon on the city strip, as if to say, "I'm watching." Someone else placed a cardboard tombstone where the parkway meets their driveway, and sharpied "Rippy Common Sense" in bubble letters a toddler could read. Janice, our block's queen of the grievance, reported all of it on the app with one line: "We're becoming that neighborhood." She didn't say which that. Miranda called a meeting for that evening, the kind where chairs get dragged into a circle so you can pretend it's a conversation. She arrived with the binder. Tori arrived with June, because if adults are going to decide what children can remember, they should have to look at children while they do it. Caleb brought an aluminum case with a drill, a torque wrench, and a tape measure, because some people think if the numbers make sense, the world will too. I brought a notebook because I have a disease that makes me write things down when they sound like they'll matter later. Miranda started with the usual throat clearing about safety and liability, and how when someone trips, lawsuits don't ask whether you meant joy. She said the board wasn't anti-Halloween. Tasteful themes are welcome, she said, and I saw a middle school art teacher flinch like she had been assigned a rubric that graded imagination. Define tasteful, Tori said, smiling in a way that made everyone else set down their paper cups. Miranda did what people do when asked to define a word that lives in their mouth like a fact. She described a feeling, no gore, no realistic distress. She used words like appropriate and family-friendly and harmonious. I wrote them down and circled them until they looked like a necklace that didn't fit any neck. Caleb raised his hand and didn't wait to be called. Define obstruct, he said. He'd brought photos of corners where hedges grow into view triangles, and no one cares because the hedges belong to people who host wine nights. He'd printed section 12.4 of the city code and highlighted the part about sightlines at intersections, which said exactly nothing about 7-foot skeletons on straightaways. He asked who had authority on the parkway, the city, the utilities, or a board that wasn't elected by anyone beyond 2 streets and a cul-de-sac that bends like a comma. Miranda said, "This isn't adversarial." Then she said, "However." Then she read a sentence from the covenants about governing common areas and standards. And then she said a thing that would ricochet through the week. If the public strip looks like a yard, it should behave like one. Sometimes the words you choose confess things you don't mean to. 2 hours later, the skeleton still glowed. Kids had started using the arch like a checkpoint in a game no adult understood. Parents were divided, but no one could deny that the street felt like a place a story might happen. Even Miranda's compliance aide, Adam, the kid who pinched the pumpkin, lingered on his cart longer than his time card wanted, like he was waiting for permission to be a neighbor, not an instrument. The next morning, the HOA posted a new warning. Unauthorized installations on the parkway will be removed. They gave the Whitakers 24 hours. Tori printed the notice, circled parkway, and taped it to the skeleton's ribcage like a badge. Caleb called the city. He reached a clerk who said if the installation wasn't a permanent structure or a hazard, and if it wasn't staking into utility easements or blocking a fire hydrant, the city is not currently concerned. I watched him repeat those words to Miranda like a person who has brought good grammar to a fight about taste. Neighbors chose sides in the quiet ways people fight when they share a street. Don't wave, wave bigger, park a little closer to the disputed strip, park a little farther as if distance were diplomacy. Someone left a note on the Whitakers' porch that said, "We're with you," and no signature, because support is braver when it can't cost you permission to borrow sugar later. On the 30th, Miranda returned with 2 volunteers and a kind of resolve that made the air feel thinner. She had a letter from council in a folder with tabs. She had a printed copy of the covenants dog-eared to the page about nuisances and unsightly conditions. She had a stack of orange zip ties, as if aesthetics could be policed with the same gear that secures sagging fences. Behind her trailed Janice, with the careful smile of someone who never forgets who borrowed a ladder and returned it a day late. "We're going to remove the arch," Miranda announced, not unkindly, but in the tone of a preschool teacher who knows she'll be questioned in a group chat later. "No," Tori said, just that word, soft as a drawn line. Miranda opened her folder and read the sentence about authority to abate unsightly conditions in common areas. Then the sentence about resident cooperation. Then she pointed to a paragraph that included parkway. Caleb held up the city clerk's email on his phone like a talisman. Miranda said city and HOA authority can overlap. Caleb said that's not how overlapping works. Miranda said she was trying to avoid conflict. Tori said nothing and placed her hand on the arch like it might bolt. The volunteers took a step forward. The skeletons watched, grinning like saints in a cheap cathedral. Then something happened that wasn't in anyone's plan. The Spencer twins, 8 years old, sticky with sweetness and dust, ducked under the arch with their scooter helmets still on and planted themselves in the exact center, like two commas stopping a sentence. "You can't take it," one said. "It's for tomorrow." Miranda looked at the twins, at their mother, who shrugged in the universal language of, "I didn't send them, but I'm not stopping them," and took a breath that sounded heavier than the plastic bones. She could go around them. She could go through this. She could be right and lose the street. "We have a process," she said to no one and to everyone. "We should be following it." She turned to leave. Sometimes a retreat is a bruise you can live with. That night, the Whitakers finished the rest of the scene. They added a fog chiller. Caleb had a friend with a restaurant-grade ice machine and a willingness to barter. And when the mask of night slipped down over the block, the archway exhaled a low ribbon of mist that loafed across the sidewalk like a lazy river at ankle height. The lights were warm, the bats barely moved. A witch, clearly plywood in daylight, cast a passing shadow now and then, and not one more than that. It was theater with a kind hand. And yet, the block hummed, because the block always hums, and humming attracts stories the way porch lights draw moths. At 10:13 p.m., someone posted a grainy photo to the app. Two silhouettes under the arch. It was labeled "After Curfew." The app doesn't have a curfew, the covenants don't either, but righteous indignation loves a rule more when it sounds invented. The silhouettes were Tori and the landscaper, Luis, who had stayed late to help rerun an extension cord up and over the magnolia because the household circuits kept popping. He was 25, meticulous, and the only guy in the zip code who could make a staked light look like it had grown out of the lawn. The post gathered the usual cloud, raised eyebrows, dots, the shake of a head typed in letters. When Caleb came out with 2 mugs, gave one to Luis, and clapped him on the shoulder, the comments deflated. Then someone zoomed the image and circled Tori's hand as it held the mug, and found in the blur of pixels what they had come looking for, the outline of a story where people were props. I tell you this because Halloween attracts ghosts we bring with us. On the morning of the 31st, Miranda taped a final notice to the skeleton's rib. Installations must be removed by dawn, November 1st. She added, in blue ink that made the paper look embarrassed, for the sake of neighborhood peace. The day itself was a watercolor that never quite dried. Leaves skipping, paper bats tapping, a ceiling of cloud moving like an ocean overhead. Kids in capes pre-gamed in driveways. Parents stood in clutches and argued about hot chocolate and whether to allow gummies that pretend to be eyeballs. The arch held. Just before dusk, a city truck rolled up. Not code enforcement. Public Works. A woman in a reflective vest, hair in a bun, stepped out and eyed the arch, the skeletons, the anchors. "Who put this here?" she asked. Tori raised her hand like she'd been called on in the gentlest class. The city worker, her name tag said Marisol, knelt, looked, traced the edge of an anchor with her gloved finger, stood, and nodded. "You're not in an easement. You're not blocking a hydrant. You're not in a sight line. You're not stapled to a tree," she said. "I'm not here to fight art." Miranda stood 3 feet away and smiled without teeth, as if the air itself had made a noise she didn't want to dignify. "Just be ready to take it down tomorrow," Marisol added. "The street sweeper hates holidays," Tori promised. Miranda said, "Thank you for your input," as if input were a thing that slid into a slot and never came out again. At 7 on the dot, the street let go. It became a river of cloth and small courage. The arch worked like a charm, not a carnival, not a trap, just a line you got to cross to be part of something that wasn't your living room. Parents who'd grumbled about jurisdiction took photos under it and sent them to grandparents who think we've all forgotten how to talk to strangers. Even Janice walked through, as if to prove it couldn't be as impressive as the kids claimed, and emerged with glitter on her sleeve and a story she tried not to tell. Then because stories like ours need their pivot, something went wrong. Not with the arch, with light. At 7:42, the bulbs flickered, then the arch's string went dark. The neighborhood let out a disappointed sound that wasn't quite a groan. Caleb jogged to the garage panel. He flipped the breaker twice, frowned, flipped another. He and Luis traced chords like veins. The fog kept rolling. The skeletons kept glowing. The arch's bulbs stayed dead. The line looked like a mouth had forgotten its smile. Miranda, without gloating, because she doesn't do gloat, she does principle, stepped toward the Whitakers. "This is a sign," she said, "and I don't think she meant it. I think she just couldn't resist a narrative." Caleb looked at Luis. Luis looked at the magnolia. "We can run power from the porch," Luis said. "Temporarily. We'll go over the sidewalk like we planned. Gaffer tape. Anyone with a stroller will be fine." Miranda raised a hand. "No cords across walkways." "Then we go above," Luis said, eyes on the branches. He had brought a fiberglass pole for this exact moment. He could arc a line like a magician. "Above is fine," Miranda conceded, because sometimes common sense wins the coin toss. Luis lifted the pole. A teen, mask skewed, voice eager, asked if he could help. Luis said no, then yes, then handed him the end to steady. They guided a slack black cord up and over the lowest limb. The teen tugged, the cord moved. Luis gave him the look men give boys when they want them to remember the feeling of being trusted. The line crested the branch. Caleb moved toward the porch outlet with the other end. That's when a patrol car turned the corner. No lights, no siren, just presence, the kind that makes people tidy their faces. Someone had called. Unpermitted structure. Trip hazard. Unsafe crowding. The report would later show 3 calls in 11 minutes, each painting the same picture with slightly different brushes. The officer, young, calm, body cam off, it would go on later, stepped out and took in the scene. Arch, skeletons, fog, a city worker leaning against her truck eating from a paper cup of chili someone had pressed into her hand. He nodded to Marisol. "You good?" She nodded back. He looked at the cord in the air. "No one climbs," he said, not unkindly. "No one climbs," Luis promised, pole already down. The officer walked the sidewalk once, slow like a lifeguard scanning the pool. He asked a few questions, the kind that demonstrate he has a script and intends to read it with comprehension. Any fights, any costumes with real metal, any open flames. Parents volunteered answers, relief spilling out where adrenaline had pooled. Then he looked at Miranda and said, "Ma'am, we can't enforce your HOA rules. We can help if there's a hazard." Miranda nodded in a way that meant she heard the words and stored them under unhelpful truths. The arch stayed. The bulbs stayed dark. Kids walked through anyway. Someone started telling the children that the dark meant the arch had learned the difference between day and night, as if the prop had personality and we were lucky enough to meet it. The line became more magical because we had to believe it was there. At 8:11, a small boy in a shark costume tried to jump to tap the string of bulbs with the back of his hand, missed and scraped his knee on the aggregate sidewalk. He cried like the street had offended him personally. His mother scooped him up. A neighbor produced a bandage with dinosaurs on it like an offering. Another neighbor produced a wipe like a magician with soft hands. The officer knelt and said, "What's your shark name?" The boy answered Kevin, because of course it was, and then everyone laughed like the street had passed a test it didn't know it was taking. Janice posted during all this a photo of the officer, the arch, a caption that said, "Some of us just want a quiet neighborhood." A dozen hearts, a dozen eye rolls, the usual economy of attention. At 8:37, a wind gust knocked one of the skeletons askew. Its zip tie slipped. The femur tilted. For a second, the scene looked like a collapsed idea. Luis jogged, righted it, tightened the tie, and stepped back. A murmur of applause rose despite itself. Even Miranda clapped once, because competence is hard to hate. At 9:01, the arch's bulbs sparked back to life. Caleb had found a tripped GFCI on an outlet behind the porch swing, reset it, and somewhere in the little miracle box we all pretend we understand, electrons resumed their labor. The crowd cheered like a small town at a high school football game. People walked through again, this time slower, as if illumination demanded gratitude. Before 10, the crowd thinned the way sugar does at a party. The officer left after a final loop and a happy Halloween. Marisol waved and told Caleb, "Midnight at the latest, or the sweeper will call me names." She drove away into a neighborhood that had, against modern odds, become briefly more than addresses. Just before 11, Miranda returned, alone. She looked at the arch, at the skeletons, at the taped notice on the ribs, at her reflection in a window that briefly made her a character in the scene she'd tried to edit. "I'm asking you," she said quietly, "to take it down tonight." Tori wrapped her sweater tighter. "We will," she said. "After midnight. We promised Marisol." Miranda nodded. "Thank you." Then she did something I didn't expect. She stepped under the archway like a traveler passing through a border, stood there a second, lifted her hand as if she might touch the bulbs, and then didn't. "And thank you for not being cruel about it," she added. "We're not trying to win," Tori said. "We're trying to belong to the place we live." "And you'll still take it down at midnight," Miranda repeated, "because principle is a habit." "At midnight," Caleb confirmed. "We like rules too, the good kind." They did. At 12:03, when the street was empty and the fog had long since given up, Tori unplugged the string with the care of someone tucking in a child. Caleb unscrewed the anchors. Luis, off the clock, unpaid, but stubbornly present, carried the arch to the garage. The skeletons came down with the slow dignity of an old tent. The right-of-way went back to being grass that belonged to the city and no one at all. By dawn, the sweeper had muttered past in a machine that sounded like currency counting. By 8, you could not tell anything had happened except for the glitter on the street that would spend a week pretending to be frost. By noon, the app had moved on to a discussion of whether Christmas inflatables should require a deposit. By 2, someone posted a photo of a tasteful harvest wreath that looked like every harvest wreath that had ever existed. 2 days later, a letter landed in our inboxes. "The board appreciates residents' cooperation during the Halloween season," it said. "Future guidelines will reflect our community's character." The word character again, like a hymn that doesn't know the verse. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't, because the street was watching. A week after Halloween, the Whitaker's magnolia shed half its leaves overnight. Caleb raked them into a perfect heap on the parkway, a mountain that made the whole block nostalgic for the exact childhood you can only rent in retrospect. Kids asked to jump. Parents said, "Careful." Miranda walked by with her dog and said, without malice, more resignation than decree, "No piles on the right-of-way." "2 jumps," Tori bargained, "then we'll bag." Miranda looked at the pile. The pile looked back. "2," she agreed, and the dog wagged its tail as if to ratify a treaty. June ran, jumped and disappeared into leaves, then emerged with hair full of brown confetti and a grin that would carry her to Thanksgiving. The street applauded itself, like it had survived something bigger than a rule. That night I went through the photos I'd taken from my porch while pretending I wasn't documenting anything at all. In one, Miranda stood under the arch, hand almost raised, eyes on light. In another, Luis and the teen held the cord like a line in a story they were learning to draw. In another, Marisol ate chili, leaning against a city truck like the government can be human on a Wednesday. If I had to tell you what our neighborhood learned, it wasn't that HOAs are villains, or that artists should win, or that rules are cages, or that public strips are loopholes. It was smaller and more portable. It was this: We live in the inches between lines on a map, and those inches belong to us if we can remember how to share them. A few days later, I found a piece of the arch's gaffer tape on the curb. It had gathered a constellation of glitter, a strand of hair, a pine needle as long as a truth, and one small sticker of a bat that must have fallen from a costume. I peeled it up and tucked it into my notebook. It's still there, on the page where I wrote tasteful, obstruction, and character, and then drew a little arch over the words. Sometimes the thing that changes a place isn't a confrontation, a vote, or a rule. Sometimes it's a wooden curve, 2 skeletons, and the promise that you'll take it down at midnight because someone asked you to. And sometimes it's a pumpkin that deflates in front of kids, teaching them something you didn't mean to. When December came, Miranda posted holiday clarification with fewer bullets and more breath. Inflatables permitted December 1st to 31, it said, provided they are secured and not in sight triangles. No tasteful, no preferred, just the parts that made sense. Tori replied with a snowman in sunglasses and no words at all. Caleb bought a shorter extension cord. Luis picked up an extra shift when it iced. On New Year's Day, I walked past the Whitakers' lawn. There was no arch. There were 2 mugs on the porch, a hint of a wreath, and glitter that had made up its mind to stay forever. The right-of-way lay there between sidewalk and street, a blank. For a second, I could see a dozen futures on that strip. Chalk drawings, lemonade stands, a folding chair where a grandparent might sit while a child rides a scooter. None of those things have a chapter in the covenants. None of them need one. We didn't become that neighborhood. Or maybe we did, just not the version Janice meant. We became the kind where a board president can step under an arch and think better in the dark. The kind where a city worker can say, "I'm not here to fight art." The kind where a landscaper stays late for free because competence deserves a better audience. The kind where kids stop you from making a mistake with their bodies and their helmets and their insistence that Halloween is tomorrow and should be ready. If character means anything beyond matching mailboxes, it might mean that. The week after New Year's, the HOA posted an agenda for annual planning and community listening. It was the kind of title that tries to sound like a couch when it's really 3 folding tables and a pitcher of water that tastes like the inside of a hose. We showed up anyway, because for all the eye-rolling we do, we keep to our rituals like people who believe dialogue is a vacuum that will clean the room if we run it long enough. Miranda opened with a spreadsheet slide that could have been the opening credits for a very boring thriller. Insurance premiums trending up, a tidy bar for legal consultation costs, an uptick in incident reports. She didn't mention skeletons or arches or public strips, but every bar had a shadow you could name if you were on our street in October. "I don't love being the heavy," she said, looking directly at no one and at all of us. "I do love a low premium." Or people laughed in the way you laugh when a truth is shaped like a brick. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She asked questions without answers hiding behind them. What do we consider safe enough? What is the smallest rule that still works? Who decides when the public belongs to us? Tori raised her hand and didn't wait. "Let me help write it," she said. "Not so I can win, so I can understand what you're trying to solve." "Liability," Miranda said. "I wake up thinking about liability and about how we look in the paper if something preventable happens." "Then write for that," Caleb said, flipping to a printout he'd brought like a dad who came to back-to-school night with footnotes. "Not for character. Write for feet and inches and lumens and decibels and clear sight lines, and give us a box to color inside big enough to feel like we live somewhere." Janice, who had taken the chair farthest from the projector screen, like she might catch a disease from bullet points, cleared her throat. "And write for me," she said, surprising herself. "I don't want to fight every month. I want to know when to stop before we're all mad on Nextdoor. Miranda took notes. I watched her hand move, the way the pen hesitated before character, then wrote sight triangles, temporary, secured, sweeper, curfew, and in the margin, Marisol. If you stick around long enough, you learn the names that actually run your life are not the ones in the newsletter. 2 weeks later, we had a draft. Temporary display, an installation policy. It was narrower and more useful than its ancestors. Anything on the parkway had to be gone by the next morning after a holiday. List every hazard in plain words. Cords must be overhead or covered, no stakes within 3 feet of utility boxes, no blocking hydrants, nothing over 8 feet in the parkway, nothing that pretends to be real peril, chainsaws, knives, actual flames. Turn strobes away from the street, decibels under the city limit after 10. It didn't say tasteful once. It didn't mention character. It used numbers where possible and silence elsewhere. Miranda invited Marisol to the working session. She brought a rolled-up map, and the amused patience of someone who knows her life is a series of calls from people who recently learned the word easement. You don't need to own the public strip to care for it, she said, which was both a blessing and a warning. We love neighbors who understand that. Luis came too at Tori's ask. He wore a polo with his company's stitched name and shoes that had seen mud like a sermon. He brought a coil of cord and a bag of gaffer tape, set them on the table and said, "If you write it down, I can build it right." We tested clauses with small arguments and larger laughter. "Define overhead," someone said. Luis stood, lifted the cord and held it to his chest. "Above my ribs," he said. "Kids can't reach ribs." "Define cover," someone else said. Luis unspooled tape, set it across the cord on the carpet, pressed it with his palm. Miranda nodded. "Define supervised," Janice tried to trip. Marisol pointed without looking. "Eyes on." We wrote eyes on into a policy. Imagine that. By March, the board voted and mailed. "Temporary policy effective immediately," the letter said, like a bandage instead of a finger wag. It added a sentence that sounded like an apology in the proper light. "We're trying something new together." Spring put its hand on the neighborhood's back and nudged. The magnolia bloomed like a wedding dress with a sense of humor. The street's children tried to ride 2 scooters at once, like circus performers, and failed as artfully as people of any age do. Tori painted her porch swing the color of a swimming pool. Caleb actually finished a project, a low wooden box around the mailbox planted with herbs, the kind of improvement that looks like it was always waiting there for someone with tools and a Saturday. Miranda walked by with her dog and didn't say a word, which in HOA constitutes a blessing. The arch stayed in the garage. You would think that would be the end of the symbol, but symbols in neighborhoods are like dandelions. They reappear where the soil's been turned. In April, the school's PTO wanted to host a Sidewalk spring fair, chalk art, lemonade stands, a used book table. The park was fine, but the strip between sidewalk and curb felt like a dare. "We can do it," Tori told them, tapping the new policy. "We've got a policy for that." She sounded like a person who had learned to love a bracket in a sentence that used to make her itch. Miranda's email that week had no subtext. It was just text. "Send me your chalk map so the sweeper knows where to moan." She signed off with a smiley face so small you had to pinch zoom your feelings to see it. The fair ran like a rehearsal for a better future. Kids drew galaxies that outlived the hose. A second grader sold bookmarks with skeletons on them because branding is forever. Janice brewed sweet tea and forgot to collect the dollar bill someone left under the jar. A teenager brought it back like it was a test, and he wanted to pass. Luis set up a demonstration of safe cord runs with a chart he printed at the library, and 10 dads nodded so hard I thought their necks would confess. Marisol parked her truck where the line turned and borrowed a piece of chalk to mark a little star next to an exposed utility cap. "Don't stake here," she wrote. Love, the city. You could feel neurons connecting in the crowd. Summer always makes rules look smaller. The grill's smoke writes new policies in the air. Policy of burgers first, policy of ice second, policy of stand in the shade if you want to live. The compliance cart learned to move slower, maybe on purpose. Adam, who pinched the pumpkin, started waving at kids by name. Quiet months collect stories, the way a well collects rain. In August, a windstorm snapped a limb off the magnolia and dropped it across the parkway at a diagonal that made drivers guess and guess wrong. Caleb and I wrestled it to the curb. Luis showed up with a saw in 6 minutes, like the tree had texted him first. Miranda called the city and then stood with us while we waited, the dog leaning into her calf like it had an opinion and wanted someone to record it. "You know," she said to no one and to us, "I used to think if the rules were clear enough, nothing would ever fall. And now," I asked, "and now I own a dog," she said. We all laughed, even the dog, who has the sense of humor some animals steal from their owners when the vet looks away. The board elections in September were dull, which felt revolutionary. Miranda ran again with a platform that could have been a tote bag slogan: clear rules, warm streets. Tori didn't run. She joined the temporary display working group because some people need a committee name to feel like momentum. Janice didn't run. She surprised no one by joining the hospitality subcommittee and surprised everyone by being good at it. Adam applied to be a city code trainee in the fall and got in. He cried in the privacy of his compliance cart and then drove 10 miles under the speed limit like a person not yet used to victory. The Arch returned to the conversation the second week of October, not because Tori pulled it out, but because June did. She's 11 now, which is a liminal age, the exact place where light and shadow change hands. She asked her parents if she could host a night of little frights for the younger kids the weekend before Halloween. A test night to make sure no one cried on the 31st. No jump scares, she promised. Just practice. "Do it," Miranda wrote on the app, without caveats. "We'll come with Coco." They pulled the Arch out of the garage and found it had absorbed the garage's smell. A cocktail of sawdust and oil and things you mean to fix. Caleb sanded a spot where the rain had lifted a splinter. Tori repainted the curve with leftover porch paint. Luis replaced the rubber feet with the kind that don't leave half moons on the brain of the city. The skeletons came down from the rafters like 2 retired gym teachers. June put bead bracelets on their wrists and named them Miss Bone and Mr. Clatter. We decided not to tell her that naming the skeletons constituted attachment. Sometimes you let kids build their own religion. The test night was the right size for its name. 10 small kids, an instruction sheet with pictures because reading is a skill made of nerves, and a chalk line like a runway. June stood at the Arch and taught the littles how to walk slow if they felt weird, how to raise a hand to take a break, how to show their candy and say thank you even if they didn't like the wrapper because the world is full of wrappers you don't like. Miranda handed out Coco like it was her fault and wanted to make up for it. Marisol didn't come because she doesn't live here, but someone texted her a photo and she replied with a heart, which is a human emoji, not a policy. I thought that would be our story this year, wholesome sequel, improved sequel, the kind of continuation that tastes like a better recipe found at the back of a drawer. But Halloween has an appetite for plots. At 4:18 p.m., on the 31st, the forecast hummed a warning and then delivered wind from the north with ideas about itself. We braced. Tori added 2 guy lines to the Arch, soft lines that would give before they broke. Caleb checked every tie. Luis hammered a ground pin with the restraint of a man who knows the parkway is not his enemy, but his teacher. The first edge of the cold front marched down the street with the smell of rain and a sheet of leaves standing on end. At 5:02, a truck that didn't belong to anyone we knew rolled too close to the curb. The driver leaned to check an address, clipped one of the guy lines with his mirror, and snapped it with a sound like a violin string deciding to live elsewhere. The arch wobbled in a slow, theatrical way and then leaned toward the sidewalk like a bow. It didn't fall. The second line held, the anchors held, the wooden feet dug in like purpose. The driver hopped out, apologies falling out of his mouth so fast you could have used them as confetti. "I can fix it," he said, holding the snapped line like a boy who broke something in a museum. "You can hold this," Luis said, handing him the base while he tied a new line from the kit that lives in his truck like a second wallet. The man held. The man watched. The man learned the knot, looked like a rabbit. The man left with a story about how he didn't ruin Halloween. "You can't buy that from a vendor. The wind kept testing us. The bulbs swayed. Kids' capes behaved like wild animals. Parents zipped jackets and put their hands on small shoulders and tried not to transmit their own fear. At 6, the fog machine coughed and declared mutiny. Luis coaxed. The machine hissed and considered. The machine produced a breath's worth of mist, and then nothing. The arch looked naked without its whisper. "Leave it," Tori said. "It's okay for the world to be less dramatic." "Unacceptable," June said, and we all laughed and then agreed when we realized she was half right. 10 minutes later, she produced 2 handfuls of fog from a bin. Batons with gauzy fabric attached, lightweight and ridiculous, the kind of thing you might build if what you wanted more than realism was a giggle. She handed them to the littles. "Wave it low," she told them, "like you're painting the sidewalk with clouds." They did. The arch didn't need electricity. It had children with wands. Halfway through the evening, a man I didn't recognize stood across the street with his arms folded like an argument. He wore a coat too nice for Halloween and a scowl too practiced for our block. He took pictures as if light owed him. He looked at Miranda, at Tori, at the arch, and at his phone like any one of them might confess. Then he walked up to Caleb and began a conversation that sounded like a deposition. "Do you have a permit for this structure?" "It's a temporary installation," Caleb said, "within the policy and the city's guidance." "Doesn't matter," the man said. "If it causes a fall, the association will be liable." "And I will be responsible," Miranda said, stepping forward, dog trotting behind her like punctuation, "which is why we built it with numbers, not feelings." "And who are you?" he asked, as if bureaucrats are self-winding toys. "The board president," she said, "and the person who will be here at 12:01 with a wrench." He opened his mouth and closed it again. He didn't introduce himself. He took 3 more photos and left, a cloud muttering to itself. Janice sidled up and said, "Ex-husband of the woman 2 doors down. He came to pick up their kid and thought he'd pick a fight on the way." We filed that under human weather. At 7:20, a girl dressed as a very determined bumblebee tripped at the far edge of the arch and grazed her palm on the rough concrete. She was more insulted than hurt. Miranda knelt, dabbed it with a wipe, put on a bandage with skeletons on it because we don't waste our branding. "You're brave," Miranda said. "Brave is not the same as not scared." The girl nodded like those were instructions she could use again. At 8:03, my doorbell camera caught something I almost missed. The compliance cart, empty, parked in my driveway so it wouldn't block the sidewalk. Adam had left a note on my porch. "Borrowed the driveway. HOA is learning manners." I smiled at a piece of paper in the cold, which is a sentence I didn't expect to write this year. At 9:31, the wind lay down like a dog that finally chose a spot. The arch rested in the quiet. The bulbs hummed and confessed nothing. Tori leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder. Luis sat on the curb and massaged his palm like a man who knows his hands are better instruments than any fog machine. Miranda walked the strip one last time, not to catch anyone, but to catch anything that needed catching. She picked up a wrapper and a bent bobby pin and a plastic spider that had lost its nation. She held them all like treasures instead of evidence. At 10:12, the crowd began to thin. At 10:47, it was just us, the people who live here when nobody is watching. We unplugged the fog machine that had become a prop for hope, coiled cords the way you coil days, pulled stakes with slow enough hands to leave the grass like a memory and not a wound. Marisol did not show because she had the night off, but a city truck rolled by and tooted its horn like a ferry leaving at the end of a shift. At 11:58, Miranda stood under the arch and looked up. "You know," she said, "I was the PTA president who cancelled the haunted hallway because of the fake blood." "You did the right thing," Tori said. "That hallway was gross." Miranda laughed. "Maybe, but I liked who I was tonight better." "We all did," Caleb said. At 12:01, the wrench turned. At 12:03, the arch became a story again. At 12:07, the parkway was grass, the skeletons were retirees, the lights were coiled in a bin like hibernating snakes, and our block was the kind of quiet that belongs to people who kept a promise. November came like a parent, turning the lights on with a soft hand. Leaves fell. We learned to rake in pairs. The board sent a thank you without a single italicized clause. "No incidents, no complaints," it said. "No lies." I don't know why the last part made me cry, but it did. In December, Miranda sent a shorter holiday clarification than last year. The tasteful line was gone. The numbers stayed, which is a way to love people. Tori put a snowman on the porch and didn't tempt her better angels with another arch. Caleb cut the extension cords to length instead of letting them coil like hazards. Luis bought himself a new pair of gloves that looked like a handshake. In January, a new neighbor moved into the ranch with the low roof and the brick that turns orange at the corners. Her name is Alana. She's a nurse who works nights and a mom who sleeps without apology. On her second week, her car was broken into at 3 in the morning, the kind of vandalism that doesn't care about our policies. She posted a screenshot from her camera, the thief's arm, the gloved hand, the light they brought with them, and took away. She didn't ask for advice. She asked for company at dawn, because a window is both a hole and a story. Tori showed up with coffee. Miranda showed up with her dog and a phone number for the detective who actually calls back. Luis showed up with cardboard and a roll of tape and covered the window without leaving a scratch. Caleb stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets like a man who knows how small hands look without purpose, and asked if she wanted someone to wait while she showered. Alana cried for 30 seconds and then didn't, which is a medical miracle worth writing about. We aren't cured of anything. We still have the group chat with its fervors and its misreadings and its missionaries from common sense. Janice still writes posts in a tone that could curdle milk. Someone still leaves their trash can mouth open on a windy day like a sailor who never learned knots. But once you've built an arch, you promise to take down at midnight, you know what you can do together and what you shouldn't. You know that the city belongs to you when you behave like you belong to it. You know which inches on a map hold the light. Last week, I took my notebook down from the shelf. The bat sticker is still stuck to the page with tasteful, obstruction, character, and a little arch I drew on a day I thought words would be enough. I added 3 more words I'm trying to practice. Eyes on, together. It is not policy. It is not law. It's the world I want to live in, written in my handwriting, which is a location I know how to return to. In the spring, June will turn 12, which is an age with its own tides. She wants to build a daylight arch for a book exchange. No fog, no lights, just a curve that invites people to step through and find a story on the other side. Tori asked the board whether a library counts as seasonal. Miranda said, "It's seasonal to being alive." And I didn't know until then that bureaucrats could make poetry if you gave them enough practice. And when the next October comes, even if the weather is wrong and the leaves are late and the app is bad, we'll pull the arch out and look at it like it's a friend who moved away and came home to a block that learned its own last name. We'll check the cords and the knots. We'll count the inches between the sidewalk and the curb. We'll ask the city for nothing and thank it anyway. We'll remind ourselves that the sweeper hates holidays, and we'll love the sweeper for hating them, because dissent is a kind of love if you know how to hold it. We'll set the curve up. We'll invite kids who are brave and kids who are scared and kids who are both. We'll let a police officer walk past without making him choose sides. We'll hand Marisol chili and watch her draw chalk stars where the utility caps sleep. We'll silence the word tasteful and speak in numbers. We'll write eyes on into the night with our hands and our presence and our mugs of whatever keeps us gentle. And at 12:01, we'll take it down, because promises are how you keep a place open for tomorrow. By February, the arch lived in the garage, the way a retired instrument lives in its case. Quiet but tuned, ready if asked. When it rained, water stitched grey lines down the driveway and pooled in the exact rectangle where the feet had pressed the grass flat. You could still see the indent if you knew where to look, the place where something stood and then didn't, where we agreed the night had been long enough and tomorrow deserved an uncluttered edge. In March, a letter to the editor in the town paper arrived like a late winter squall. Neighborhoods drowning in decorations, who protects safety and sanity? The writer didn't name us, but the sentences wore our October like a jacket 2 sizes too big. Public right-of-way, not public circus, it said. These temporary installations teach our children to disrespect rules. Someone clipped it with real scissors. You could see the jagged left margin, and taped it to the clubhouse corkboard as if pinning a moth made it less alive. Miranda took it down and put it in a file. Tori read it out loud on the porch with the lightest possible voice, as if inviting a wind to take the worst of it. Caleb shrugged. Every town has a person who writes letters like that, he said. Ours just bought ink. Luis told a different story at the hardware store counter. A man stopped me in aisle 12, he said, flicking his eyes between bins of screws and our faces. Asked how to anchor a shade sail safely over a picnic table. Said he'd read about running lines high, not across. Said he didn't want anyone to trip. Luis smiled, the way a person does when cause and effect shake hands. The world learns in weird places. April brought a walk audit, a term borrowed from traffic engineers and transformed into neighborhood ritual. Marisol printed little maps, smaller than a hand, and circled hydrants and utility lids and the places where, if you stake, a truck somewhere far away would sigh. We walked 2 blocks with clipboards like we were applying for a job. Kids argued earnestly about where chalk drawings should end before the corner. Someone invented the heel rule for chords. If your heel can't snag it, you're fine. Miranda wrote heel rule in the policy margin and drew a tiny shoe. The audit ended at the Whitakers' driveway with lemonade and a confessional. Miranda pressing her palm to the old arch indent and saying, "I'm not sorry I asked you to take it down. I'm sorry I didn't know how to ask for help carrying it out of the way of the sweeper without sounding like I didn't like joy." Tori nodded, which was forgiveness in a language without exclamation points. June curled a finger into the dog's fur and said, "We can build it faster this year anyway." And the dog agreed with its whole spine. May is for graduations, and discovering the mower needs a belt you should have replaced in March. June is for sprinklers pretending to be small rain, and for finding out which neighbor grows mint like a promise. July thickens the air until even arguments move slow. August breaks something you thought was fine and teaches you the part number is always 8 digits long. In September, a new couple moved into the stucco with the cinnamon roof at the bend, Graham and Priya, and brought with them an optimism you could see from space. "We heard about your Halloween," Priya said to Tori, voice hopping slightly like a stone on a pond. We lived in a building for 5 years where trick or treat was 3 bowls at a lobby table guarded by a bored concierge. Teach us how to do it right. That is the sentence that unlocks a neighborhood. Teach us. Tori handed them a printed copy of the policy like a cookbook and then added what print can't hold. Numbers are for safety, she said. Everything else is for welcome. Graham confessed he had a giant spider in a box the size of a refrigerator and a rope ladder in a smaller one. We can make it behave, he added quickly, like someone who had been to enough meetings to know the weather. Luis promised a safe route from porch to branch. Caleb promised he had a voltage tester within reach and opinions about cord gauge that could lull a cranky toddler to sleep. October crept in, then raced. The magnolia traded half its leaves for air. The afternoon light learned a new angle and tried it every day. The arch came out of its case and inhaled. You could smell last year's fog in the grain, or maybe that was memory seasoning wood. The Saturday before Halloween, Graham climbed 2 steps on his ladder to whisper to the spider's motor like at a wake, while Priya read a list she'd written in neat block letters. No chasing, no dropping, no surprise from above, no legs across the sidewalk. Luis adjusted the rope with the gentleness of a nurse loosening a band. Above ribs, he reminded everyone, eyes on. Miranda checked sight triangles and for the first time smiled first and measured second. At 7:08, the spider turned its head slowly, no hiss, no lunging, and blinked 2 soft eyes that made even the littlest bumblebee believe it was pretend. Kids squealed anyway, because squealing is a currency they spend gladly. The spider worked because it behaved like a prop and not a threat. Luis leaned on the curb like a proud uncle. Miranda stuffed the incident report form deeper into her clipboard and didn't take it out again. At 8:23, Graham's phone buzzed. He stepped aside to answer and returned with a face that had learned a new rule the hard way. Our upstairs window camera just pinged, he said quietly to Priya. It says, unfamiliar face at 8:21. The old story tilted in my chest. Priya shrugged and said, us, we're outside. She lifted the phone. The clip showed the spider's legs swaying in wind, the porch light, the blur of a human shape moving inside. Oh, she said sudden, my sister. She flew in early. I gave her the code. I forgot to register her face. Miranda peered over with diplomatic curiosity. Luis glanced without inserting himself. Tori pretended to adjust a bat and listened, which is what grown-ups do when they sense a cliff near children. Priya texted. A shadow moved in the upstairs hall. A hand waved toward the camera like an apology. The app posted familiar face 15 seconds later, because even software can learn if you teach it who belongs. Graham exhaled like a man who had just found a step in the dark. Note to self, he said. The app isn't a bouncer. It's a very nervous usher. Welcome to the club, Tori smiled. If history repeats, it sometimes does it kindly. On Halloween proper, the block did what blocks do when they have rehearsed. It played the same song better. The arch stood within its measurements. The spider inclined its head without demanding screams. The right-of-way held. The kids moved like comets. Marisol drove by and honked twice on purpose. The officer from last year walked with his own toddler dressed as a traffic cone, which, depending on your appetite for symbolism, either proves God writes jokes or we do. At 9:58, a ladder appeared where it shouldn't. We saw it together, the way you see tragedy before the phone rings, the way you feel rain before the first drop. A teenager had dragged it from a garage across the street, someone's uncle's tool, someone's brave idea, and leaned it against the magnolia outside the policy boundary. He was 3 rungs up and grinning at a girl on the sidewalk, which is a reason even adults forget the ground. Hey, 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 Luis said, not shouting, barely more than breath. The kind of sound that can travel through noise. He stepped under the ladder, palm up, not touching, just there like the world's gentlest jack. "Feet," he said. The boy looked down, blinked, and then obeyed. "Rungs, one by one," Luis coached. The boy descended into relief instead of a story. Miranda arrived at the same second from the other side, hand extended but empty. "Let's leave the vertical to the trees," she told him lightly, and the boy nodded because embarrassment is easier than fighting when two grown-ups catch you with a net made of tone. We learned something else in that moment. Policy can be a mesh, not a wall. At 11:30, you could feel the night exhale the way a theater does after curtain. The spider bowed, the arch stilled. The last group of kids performed a final loop like pilgrims who were allowed to return to their couches with candy as indulgence. We collected wrappers like geologists. We found one glove and 3 bobby pins and the back of a badge that must have fallen off a costume and become a fact. At 12:01, the wrench turned again. It felt less like an ending and more like an annual rite, the closing move in a dance everyone now knew. Luis unsnapped, Caleb unbolted, Tori caught, Miranda counted, June held the flashlight deliberately steady as if the beam were part of the tool. Priya and Graham coiled the spider's tether with fresh reverence because learning is a sacrament. It leaves you cleaner. I went home and put my notebook on the kitchen counter. The bat sticker hadn't lost its stubbornness. I turned to a new page and wrote 2 small squares on the left margin and 2 on the right, the sidewalk and the curb, the inches between. In the middle, I drew the arch the way a child would, then the word promises, then 1 line under it, take it down at midnight. I thought I was done writing when something moved at the edge of the frame. Adam stood at the end of my driveway, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the place where his cart would have been if a younger version of him hadn't learned to park it elsewhere. He saw me, lifted his chin in that small American greeting that works from tractors to porches, and said, "You know, for a while I thought my job was to find what was wrong." "And now?" I asked. "And now I think it's to notice what's working," he said, "and not mess it up." We laughed, the tired, clean laugh of people who are allowed to go to bed. The street hummed itself to sleep. The magnolia held still because even trees need to rest. Somewhere a camera watched nothing, and for once didn't edit it into a story. In the morning, the right-of-way lay there, plain and ordinary, bare as a sentence without adjectives. The sweeper passed with the same mutter as last year, disliking holidays with renewed vigor. The policy binder sat under the clubhouse mail slot with a string of sticky notes, like flags on a patient country. Someone had chalked in tiny letters at the corner where the arch had been, "See you next time." No flourish, no skulls, just a promise in dust that would wash away and still be true. There will be another October. There will be another letter somewhere insisting we are drowning. There will be a new family that doesn't know where the power outlets are, and a kid brave enough to say, "I'm scared," and walk anyway. There will be a moment at 7:42 when a thing fails and we choose humor over spectacle. There will be a patrol car that turns the corner and decides to be part of the neighborhood instead of the plot. There will be a city truck with a woman eating chili, loving her job in the exact way her job needs to be loved. There will be a board president under an arch, looking up, thinking better. There will be a landscaper with a knot that saves the night. And there will be those familiar inches between sidewalk and curb where we practice being a town, the thin strip where rule and welcome meet, where we lay down our tape measures and pick up our hands, where we build the thing we promised to take down at midnight and do.